Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the GRI seminar. Thanks for joining us online. We took a decision this morning to move it online given the developing COVID situation in Christchurch. Hopefully things will play out okay with that, fingers crossed, but just being cautious by having it online rather than gathering in person. So welcome. We're really pleased to have Professor Richard Green with us. Richard's been engaged with the GRI since its inception, I think, Richard, right? Yeah. So he's on the steering group for the GRI. And so it's we thought it was about time that you came and talked to us about your work, which is really fascinating. I have a little bit of an overlap with your work in that I do use point cloud data, but largely from LiDAR collected by airplanes to look at the terrain data. So this is going to be a completely different perspective when we're looking across the ground. So Richard's going to be talking about lots of his work in plant remote sensing, I guess. Plus, you've also done lots of drone work, including drones which do pruning of vines, which is pretty cool. Without going into any further details, I'll let you get on, Richard. But welcome and thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah.
Oh, and I just make a comment that if you've got questions, do just write them in the chat and I will pick them up later on.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Richard.
Right, I'll share the screen. Assume everybody can see that. I'll be, as Matt said, I am covering quite a few projects, about a dozen externally funded projects altogether. I'm going to be touching on 8 of them during this talk. And of course, I couldn't do that without having a really awesome team to support me. So about 4 postdocs, a dozen PhDs, and a whole lot of staff. A lot of our work is in AI and deep learning and that sort of thing. And we've got a whole lot of staff just within this department that specialize in various aspects of AI, like Karush, Nishtian, and James Atlas, and Akun Ben Adams, Tanya Mitrovic, who started the ball rolling in the mid-90s, and so on. Andrew Bamer-Smith, and the main 2 postdocs, Oliver Batchelor and Josh McCulloch. So when I'm presenting here, I'm not presenting my own personal work, although I'm very much engaged in supervision and working with these people. But it's just so that you're aware there's very much a team effort, which often spills over to other departments. So gone are the days where we can sit in an office with cobwebs going around us, working away at a computer. It's always a team effort, and electrical, mechanical, and a whole bunch of other departments who are involved with me. So looking down that view on that front screen, it's pretty, typical remote sensing view, and you can see that the tops of the trees, but we can't really see the understory under the canopy and so on. And there's a whole lot of information there from a GIS point of view that we're missing that could be essential to our understanding of the environment we're looking at. So this is a brilliant video. As you can see, that little beastie trundling along there, it did work before we went online, so sorry about that. So it's basically an array of 6 12 megapixel cameras. It's got like 10 times the LEDs on now. We thought, well, if we can't beat the sun, let's join it. So let's make it really unsafely bright lights. Sorry, unbrightly safe lights. And over a large vineyard, that's going to be collecting about a petabyte of data to generate our models. So it's a lot of work. And then we've got drones running around. Hey Matt, are you able just to mute everybody except me?
I will give that a go, but yeah, just please mute, and I will see what I can do about that. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks.
Muted everyone.
Yep. So here's a drone flying around. This is completely autonomous, so there's no one touching this, but it just gives you an idea of, the idea of swarms of drones wandering around our forests, spinning around trees and collecting a whole lot of under canopy data without us doing anything. Now, we tend to think of GIS as just being land-based, but we're looking at vast areas underwater. So the government's looking at mussel farms, for example, with our lovely shallow wide continental shelf around New Zealand, going up to 10K offshore with thousands of hectares of mussel farms. So this becomes a lot of very important georeference data with underwater drones. So, so there's looking at underwater, land-based, and aerial. We are working in a wide range of domains, collecting very precise data down to 0.1 millimeter. So we're very interested in how much information we can extract, what we would normally call under canopy. So one of the projects is with Singapore. So the New Zealand and Singapore governments thought, wouldn't it be a brilliant idea to get together and do a bunch of data science projects? And one was health, one was linguistics, and I was more involved in the tree one. So that's been going, yeah, really interesting and going well. Interesting working across countries, but a wee bit more challenging during lockdown and so on. So typically we're doing tree segmentation from remote sensing above. So that gets a bit more challenging, and we'll go more into the research later of how you're doing dense canopies where there's a whole lot of different layers of trees. So you get all this understory plants, and you're trying to understand how you can extract that. So we're doing species recognition, and not just from the normal approach of perhaps the color, but we're doing very close under canopy work with both walking around them with drones, looking at the bark, the leaf shape, looking at disease on leaves and a whole bunch of other things. And using that data to inform the aerial views. So working like with Christchurch City Council, Auckland Council, where they have a lot of flyover data from both satellite and planes flying over with LiDAR and RGB. And we're seeing how much more information under the canopy we can do to complement that, and therefore to try and get more information out of all that remote sensing data. The other thing they're interested in Singapore, where they're very, very precious about their trees. In fact, it's illegal to even plant a tree there. They know where every tree is, and they want to know how it's going to impact people in terms of shade, humidity, wind, and so on. And so they want to know how the buildings are affecting it and how they affect flow around buildings. So there's a whole lot of social aspects in this project as well, which is great. And so we're sort of looking at doing a much better job of the instance segmentation from above, and then, as I said, integrating under canopy information. So we're trying to get a much better understanding of how they both relate, how they
Sorry, Richard, something has come up and you're being muted.
all right.
It was only just as you switched up.
Oh, that's good. Oh, that's good. Okay. I'll try not to switch mute on as I switch slides in. Yeah, so there's species recognition, not just for, just from the general shape, but we're actually getting the entire branch structure of the tree. So first, second, third leaders and so on. The leaf shape, because we're doing sub-millimeter, we're using color. So we're essentially getting a full 3D model of the tree. And I titled this talk 3D semantic models. And what I mean by that is we're getting a full 3D model of the tree. So not just looking at a point cloud of the tree, but imagine a labeled point cloud where you know that all these points are a part of that branch, and all these points are part of the first leader and that leaf and so on. So you end up with a 3D model, and I'll get more into that a bit later. It's very well labeled, and that also, and even bark down to bark texture. So it gives us a lot more information about the tree. And from this, we're doing profiling parameters like what is the volume of various aspects of the tree? What is the volume of the whole tree? What are the diameters and the sizes of things? So information that becomes way more useful when you're scanning from above. How much of this information, based on what we've done below, can you actually extract and basically do an estimate of what the tree structure may be, which could affect wind flow and a whole lot of other aspects. So that those profiling parameters then feed onto other research work packages within this. So this drone, as I said before, although it looks a bit erratic as though a human's controlling it, the only human around is someone running around in the background with an emergency stop button, just in case it suddenly pole drives into the net side, because there's a lot of weight there and it's got a sharp cutting tool on the front. It's when the government gave me $1 million to weaponize drones with a lethal blade, and you sort of think, what could possibly go wrong? So hence all the safety things. So we make sure we even stand 1 meter back from the net, just in case it does go awry. And because we were tasked with pruning, we have to get a 3D model of the tree, because we have to know which branches we're pruning, where we're pruning them, and so on. And because we're flying around every tree in a forest, then that was a natural consequence, was to have a 3D model of every tree in a forest. And it's like our third largest export industry. So there's a strong interest in how much wood is there. So we're getting very, very accurate volume estimations. So you can imagine if you're flying around every tree, then you are getting a lot more information. So, for example, can you see my mouse? Yes.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So just using a nice simple, because we're so close, Intel D435, a couple of $100. We're flying around a tree, getting all these views. We end up generating a 3D point cloud, get rid of a whole of the outliers, do some SLAM, which basically helps us with our 3D reconstruction of it. And then we're using some deep learning to recognize the trees, the terrain. So what is tree, what is not tree, and which tree is which, and so on. Then fitting a surface mesh, but best fit surface mesh to the tree. And that helps again to get rid of even more outliers of erroneous points. And then we end up with a whole lot of tree metrics, so we can understand, what the diameter is and so on. Like there's diameter over stumps, a phrase that's used in forests where they want to know, about chest height. If you walk up to a tree, what's the diameter of that tree? And all this information is used. And at the moment, of course, you can get a reasonable amount of information about heights of pine trees when you fly over them. You don't get every single one of them, but not the information of what is the volume of wood in the tree and what is diameter over stumps and things like that. So we're just getting way more information that we're integrating with remote sensing data. So this is over really large areas, and hence why I think this is relevant to this talk on GIS. So that's why this talk is not focused on how do we prune and how do we do all these manual labor tasks we have robots doing. It's more focused on how does the data we get complement really large regions of GIS data where we are looking at on the tree. It's getting down close to millimeter data for the pine trees. So it's really a large amount of data. I just throw this slide in because although we're working with people like Aeronavix and other people around New Zealand who are developing drones that carry spray and so on, it was just something that came out recently, hit the market this year of, developed a sort of a low-cost way to carry spray. And because it's surprising how many people seem to be focused on detecting wilding pines at the moment, because it's such a huge problem. And it's one thing to detect them on a nice flat area and they're sparsely populated, and another thing when it's in dense forests on steep slopes, and then trying to calculate how you get from one tree to the other down a deep slope where a tree could even be hidden. So you have to change where you're going and recognize them on the fly. So there's quite a lot of real-time deep learning classification involved in this when we are flying to do tasks like this. So it's not just, right, we've done a scan with some remote sensing aerial scan and we know where all the wilding pines are. There's also a lot that can well be hidden that we want to get rid of as well. So we started off a while ago doing this for Unisim up in the North Island, where they wanted to recognise tree encroachment onto vegetation encroachment onto their power lines, or conductors as they call them. And they also wanted to know how much the conductors were drooping, because they get old and tired, the wires do, and they start to droop a bit more. Of course, they also droop, depends how much current's going through them, they warm up, and depends on the temperature of the day. So, but they can take all that into account by doing a scan. And we thought, wouldn't it be fun to do an aerial scan? Yeah, which is great, except that the council were very reluctant to give permission of experimental drones flying over people's heads on footpaths. So then we realised that they have a whole army of linesmen running around in their vans where their power lines are, and so we ended up with a kit on top of the vans that was just going all the time anyway, collecting data, and then when they got to base, they just dumped this data down without the driver even being aware it's doing, with a Wi-Fi link, and cleared the data for the van going out the next day. So they were, without any extra manual labour involved, they were scanning on all their conductors on a continuous basis and having advantage of all this data. So this sort of inspired us with the New Zealand Biological Heritage National Science Challenge, where Steve Pawson from University of Canterbury was sort of leading our work on this down here, where we thought, well, we could be doing the same thing on, say, in Auckland on rubbish trucks, for example, thinking of some vehicle that's going around every week to check for biosecurity hazards on trees, because we could have very high resolution stereo cameras on the top of the trucks. So something better than LiDAR, because now we want to recognize what could be happening on the bark and the leaves themselves and so on. So we're sort of like talking, getting down to, like, again, that millimeter, sub-millimeter resolution and 3D models of the trees. And so that's what we're working on now, which is quite a big project, where we're hoping, that eventually we'll have MPI and a whole bunch of councils taking advantage of this. Because anything that we can do that doesn't involve labour and is just happening anyway, but we're collecting data over really vast areas and then integrating that with the remote sensing data, it becomes very, very useful exercise. So it was about 10 years ago, the government gave me $3 million to prune vineyards, and we got it working about 85% of the time, which got a big green tick from MBIE, which was great. However, it's not good enough to commercialize. And there were, back then we couldn't get the cameras high enough resolution to really do it. We didn't have deep learning. There's been a whole lot of breakthrough since then. The processing power with all these embedded GPUs that people are churning out now, is that the power available and the cost that's come down is amazing. The quality of the computer vision algorithms have got up, but we did a reasonable job, and we were doing 3D models of whole vineyards. So you can sort of see, there's the big beastie. I confess I cheated. I thought, outdoors is too hard, so I'll just bring the lab outside. So so that's got a blue screen background, bright lights over this side, LED lights, and 3 high res for back then, 1 megapixel, which wasn't high enough, and we generated some reasonably respective 3D models. You don't look so too closely, you won't notice that there's a whole lot of disconnects in the vines and so on, and you have problems with up to 7 vines overlapping in one place. So it's quite challenging. But what we didn't realize, because we're only obsessed with pruning vines, was that because we're just using the data and throwing it away, that the vineyard owners really wanted this data, because for the first time we were getting 3D models, albeit not perfect, of every single plant in their vineyard, which they'd never had before, which for us was easy to do. It was just a byproduct of what we were doing. So that was when we learned to be more engaged with the longitudinal viticultural researchers, because they're very interested in this over vast areas, and to do such large areas, they were pretty much limited to just what they had available from remote sensing. So yes, we've been working with them ever since on how will we integrate this and the robot pruning it. So now, with much better quality algorithms and cameras and everything, we're outside. Although I do confess we cheated a bit. So we've got 10 times the number of bright LED lights. So it's completely unsafe for humans to look at, because I thought, well, we've got all these shadows from bright sunlight and that, let's just beat the sun and have it as bright as the sun, which did solve a lot of problems for us. So not worrying about blue screen, all that sort of thing. So whether it's overcast, sunny, 24/7, as long as it's not raining, we can be scanning a vineyard and even put a robot arm on this platform. So as you can see, there's a slight difference in size from a huge big beastie like that to a small platform like this, and cost. You know, you're talking about hundreds of thousands down to, you know, 20, 30,000 for something like this. So a really big difference in cost, much more affordable, and moving much faster now, because we've got global shutter cameras. That 12 megapixel ones are affordable. So as I mentioned before, there's an array of 6 12 megapixel cameras up here, synced with the lights, because the lights are so bright, we have to pulse them, otherwise they overheat. And they can go pretty fast now with our latest version of this, trundling along rows. And so there's, you know, just goes along the road. It's proximal navigation, so not using GPS, or using GPS so we know approximately where we are, but we're very interested in keeping all the cameras within a sweet spot of what we're imaging. And so this is a really big trick to doing very high quality 3D reconstruction at sub-millimeter, where you do want to integrate it with your remote sensing. You really want to be in control both of your lighting and how far the camera is away. So it's a really good quality navigation. Just goes to the end of the road, turns around, scans the other side. We were only doing one side before, now we're doing both sides, integrating them, and then doing the same on the next row. So, you know, fairly straightforward sort of a navigation task. But where we've got a drone that just quickly maps the whole vineyard, and so the so we can know exactly where the vines are, and of course the owner knows where all their vines are. And we're doing the same in orchards now. They're starting to 2D trellis orchards like they do vineyards. So that's getting much easier to scan and automate as well. And so that's a big project led by Bruce McDonald and Auckland University for pruning vineyards, thinning fruitlets in orchards, and so on. Yeah, so and here's the trick. So getting into the research, it's not just the 2D images. It's how do you, not just how do you get really high quality 12 megapixel 2D image, it's how do you get really high quality depth values. So that's the real trick, is knowing that if you've got, like, imagine 2 fingers next to each other, your 2 small fingers, you can unambiguously see just from the depth values which finger is in front of the other. I mean, you'd think, it'd be obvious, because, you know, like you can see the line on one vine would clearly be going along over the top of the line on the other. And yes, it is for most cases, but there is enough errors that we've discovered you can't rely on that. And that's why we realized you need to go up to 12 megapixels. Sort of 5 is probably good enough, marginal 5 megapixels. But then you're not going to necessarily have enough information for disease on leaves and things like that for other applications. And all these tiny little tendrils that wrap around the wires, you know, if we're not capturing those, they interfere with our estimates of where the vines are. So the point was to have really, really clean and ambiguous ones. So we're doing better than stereo, the traditional stereo ways, approaches using deep learning. So we've got some really good research going on this. And we need this. This is like step 1, getting the high, very, very high quality depth clouds. And then step 2 is, once we've got those accurate depth values, that we can then start doing something with it. But it takes a lot of work, and also we've got to be doing this in real time as well. You know, we can't just be trundling along and then rely on everything being post-processing if we're going to be pruning it. Though most of the time, I confess, we can cheat and do post-processing because when we come along with the robot arm, if we're doing regular scans of it, the robot arm can assume there's already been a model generated and the decisions have already been made as to which canes to prune, and so then it can prune. So at the moment, we can cheat a little bit and don't have to be guaranteed to be real time, but we have to be near real time. We can't take weeks after each scan for us to have a perfect model. So once we've got a 3D point cloud of the entire plant, so we were just looking at the heat maps of the depth fields before. Now we've actually got the 3D texture overlaying and going and thinking, all right, we've got this 3D texture as well. How do we join this all together? So we really want to get that 3D model. So by the 3D model, I mean, it's got all the texture on the plants and we know all the dimensions of it. So hence this talk, the 3D semantic model. And we can relate this to all the remote sensing data we've got over these vast areas of vineyards. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, we're talking about a terabyte of data per vineyard. And then we've got to do a huge data reduction to reduce that down to what's really useful, trying to think ahead of what viticultural researchers might need 1 year, 2 years, 5 years ahead, where they're trying to look at every single plant over time. Now, in the French vineyards where you're selling bottles for hundreds of dollars a bottle, yes, they'll be lovingly pruning every plant and they might know each plant reasonably well. And with this technology, we're heading down that same path where we get to the point where we have intimate knowledge of every single plant. And it means that while this is trundling along, it could be doing soil samples and a whole lot of other things, which is well established, but this is just doing the really hard part. And we've been doing successive scans like every 2 weeks just to see and aligning them every time to see how the volume's increasing and things like that, which becomes very useful information. So getting into some more of the research areas. So we want to do this, automatic segmentation of the branch structure and foliage. So, we've got to look at different deep learning models, which we are constantly innovating. So a lot of people use deep learning as a black box. Train an existing black box model with some data, feed your data in and get your results out. Whereas we tend to be more looking at innovating novel architectures of deep learning to do things that haven't been able to be done before. Because we're outside in a horrible environment. The wind's always blowing the leaves. It's the same with underwater. The seaweed and so on that we're looking underwater, the mussels are always moving a bit in the water current. So it gets some interesting, painful challenges that we have where we're trying to do 3D reconstruction of leaves, for example, or branches that are moving all the time, which is good, gives some good research challenges, because all the research up to date really for, say, estimating how far you traveled from one frame to the next based on how much all the feature points moved in the scene, called visual odometry. That works great indoors and all the research has been done indoors, but when you're outdoors and most of the features in the scene are moving, that becomes more complex. And the same for doing 3D reconstruction of objects. It's been indoors, static objects, 3D reconstruction of them is done and dusted, but when you're trying to do this outdoors with an object that's moving all the time, and it feels like on the calmest day, the leaves are still moving. It's like, how do we do that? And then, of course, there's occlusions, like I said, multi-storied bush, where you're trying to understand from your view as you're flying over, you're having a whole sequence of views. How much can we see? How well can we do the instant segmentation? And how much does the under canopy flights help inform us of this? Because, as I mentioned, in the forest, we're doing a lot of flight under canopy. And of course, then there's going to be places where it's just too dense for a drone to fly. So, like we're doing a lot of autonomous routing of navigation underneath canopies to see how effective we can get as much data as we possibly can. So, so this gives some really good challenging. But there's also just simply the self-occlusion of a plant, of a tree. And I'm not saying that we're trying to see inside a tree where the leaves are so dense they're completely obscuring the inner layers. The trees are a bit more sparse than that, or deciduous trees and so on. So as I mentioned before, we're looking at species classification, not just from images, but also looking at the 3D model. What is the structure of first, second, third leaders, leaf shape, color, bark texture, and so on. So really looking at extracting as much information as we can to see how much we can complement aerial views above the trees. So we have also been working very hard on synthetic data, because what that gives us is a really high quality ground truth. And there's some very good virtual simulators out there. Like we'd use SpeedTree, for example, but like whether you're buying assets for the Unreal Engine and populating it or whatever, people have done a very good job of getting high quality models in these environments. And that's very useful for us, because when we're like scanning a tree, how accurate is our model? And by doing the same thing, adding a bit of noise as the camera moves around a tree in a virtual environment, we can have got a very high quality ground truth. So we know exactly how bad we are doing the job and how many errors it does have. So, it starts off with one image on the left, it's pretty noisy, a whole lot of points that shouldn't be there. And this is just part of camera noise and the environment noise and so on. And then, there's processes to hugely clean this up, so you get a really clean model and remove all the outliers and so on. And then basically, with a bit of a pipeline to skeletonize the tree. So what's so obvious to us humans, well, there's a contiguous branch and it carries on. To a computer system, it's just a whole lot of random points in space that, like maybe there's some proximal things, but they're also right next to some other points on a different branch. And so how do you follow through the skeleton? We've tried this in 2D, and then try to look at 2D scans of branches and vines. And yes, it worked, but not well enough. We still had too many errors. So we've come to the conclusion we have to have really very, very high quality point clouds in 3D and do the skeletonization following on 3D. Fortunately, generally branches and vines and that sort of approximate cylinders, apart from the gnarly trunk, first leader, but that's good enough for us to do a very good job for the most complex part. And the gnarly trunk can just simply be more your standard 3D reconstruction. And so that's actually working quite well. But again, as I said, innovating some deep learning approaches to even be able to go this far, and looking at how we link up, how we approximate these, how we link them up. What is the computational speed of this? As I said, we can't have a scan taking weeks for each orchard or vineyard or a large area. It has to be closer to hours or whatever if it's not real time. And we've tried going around trees with a handheld just to see, okay, how much data can we get, and then find, well, we can do a reasonable approximation model, but not really good enough for what we want. So so that's why we've sort of ended up going around drones. Of course, that is limited. Like, you'd have to get permission from a council if you're going to start doing a whole lot of trees in areas that are land owned by councils because of CA regulations, and the same in every other country. But there are ways of doing that, so long as you provide sufficient health and safety constraints to various projects. There's no reason we can't, and do it really quickly by having a whole lot of drones just autonomously flying routes around trees, and all in the same vicinity as where you are. So it's something that we can capture data quite fast. Here's I live across the road from the university in Old Heritage House, and here's a kowai tree right outside the billiard room in this old house, and we just did a drone and captured it and ended up doing a really good job. So we're sort of starting with New Zealand natives in this Singapore project, like kowai tree and Pahurikara and so on. that was reasonably complex because of the occlusion by all the flowers as well. So other areas that we're covering, really large areas, is like Antarctica. So typically this has been done in the past with looking at an aerial view, and this is basically for images of seals and trying to understand the behavior of seals and how many they are. As you know, 60 centimeters is considered high resolution, although it's great to see, more and more people throwing satellites up there which have ever increasing resolutions, which is absolutely brilliant. Of course, we're still constrained by cloud and so on. So, over the summer season, when we're down there, it's only about, maybe 10 flyovers per season. With the current satellites, I realize there's more and more going up there that'll be more frequent than that. So, you still need validation ground count. So, so a little tiny, get a satellite image. So we've got an area like this, which we've blown up here, and these little black dots are seals. And in the past, we've sort of like done a bit of, inspired people online to, crowdsource to help us count seals and so on. And then more recently, like from last year, the data we got, we actually did a deep learning approach using a network trained to see seals. And here the individual seals have got yellow circles around them, and when there's pairs, like it could be a mother and its pup, it's got a blue circle around them. And as you know, they've just got 344 million to do a Scott-based redevelopment, which is sort of so long overdue. And they are very interested in how much the rebuild noise will impact the behavior of the seals. So we thought, well, if we're going to set up something this time, why not go for the latest tech rather than the old tech they've been using for a while? So we've just sent down a couple of 187 megapixel cameras, and because we're interested in seeing how much of the seal can we see? Can we see enough markings to automatically identify individuals? Can we see a little bit about their movement so we can understand if they're disturbed or not? And can we give real-time feedback to the developers who are studying next summer? So we've got sort of this year to sort of get all the data from this year and then see, right, what do we really need to be going full on real-time next year, so you can have real-time alerts coming back to say, that huge noise you made just spooked the seals. Is there any way of doing that quieter sort of information? So yeah, so really interesting, and opens up a whole lot of research opportunities for the behavioral scientists as well, and the environmental biologists and so on. Suddenly opens a whole lot of doors for them. And it's similar working with cacophony and looking at predators under the canopy. So most of our predators are nocturnal, like possums, hedgehogs, stoats, weasels, and so on. And we're using thermal cameras there, and it's really like, great, we can see how we can do that for one spot. How do we cover vast areas? And it's always the challenge. And to cover vast areas, it immediately means you have to have some autonomous way. And maybe it's swarms of drones covering vast areas of New Zealand just to do estimates of predators, let alone trying to maybe take them out with cacophony, or looking at firing, for example, miniature paintballs at them. So because they're all nocturnal and self-grooming, so they'll go away, lick it off, rather than just peppering the whole environment with poison to make it, see if we can actually control it a bit more selectively. Yeah, so we've been talking above land, which is what we're used to in GIS technology. And here we're looking at, as I mentioned before, really vast areas, seriously vast areas underwater. So we're looking at doing high quality georeferencing. So there's things that have come out now that used to cost about $20,000, and now it's down to about $1,000 for doing really high quality sensoring of exactly how far you're moving in relation to the seabed using sonar, and as you can see, most of our work is optics. So we want to know, for example, how big are the mussels, what is their health, what's that biofouling organisms growing on the mussels, recognizing it, and really doing very high quality scans that can just be sent back. At the moment, you can see there's a tether attaching this. So the goal is to, the whole point of being autonomous is to get rid of the tether, so this can just be doing this on a constant basis. Because if you've got thousands of hectares of mussel farms offshore, you really cannot afford to have a whole lot of people there. And so because it's such a long way from land, and so you want to think of ways that you can automate this. So that was a big part of this CIFTI project, led by Cawthron, where it's how do we automate this over really large scales. And as I mentioned, from a GIS point of view, we're used to what we can see from remote sensing data, but what if we can't see it because it's under the water? So we still want to georeference it over really large areas, all this hidden information. That again, our goal here is getting down to sub-millimeter accuracy, because some of the organisms, like biofouling organisms, you need about 0.1 mil to be able to distinguish the good ones from the bad ones for one of the organisms. So that's why we're going that level. So to help us do this, we've done a really thorough job of simulating the environment. So everything we're doing, we're running simulators. On this one, we've published a whole lot of research papers, like even how, for example, plankton reflects the light back and things like that, and scatters the light, so that we can do such realistic simulations of the environment that the code runs line for line in the on the simulator and in the drone. And we've even like gone out, out to some mussel farms, which is quite expensive to do that, and decided, we wanted to tweak something, remote it into the server running the Unreal Engine at Canterbury University, tweaked some code, checked it ran okay, then just dumped the code down on the drone while we're out at sea, and it ran perfectly. So it does really hugely speed up development. So, and as well as that, we want to know where all these buoys are holding up. So we're doing, as well as cameras on buoys, actually having drones just basically flying waypoints, so normal stuff, but they want to know how high in the water is that, because the mussels grow and they slowly get lower and lower in the water until they actually go below the top of the water and sink below it. So they want to know ahead of time when that's happening. So yeah, and as you all know, it's easy to just set up drones to follow autonomous paths, and we've been using some deep learning approaches to segment them well. And another underwater one has been scallops. So at the moment, appallingly, they drag big chain nets behind, completely destroy the ecology of the seabed to harvest scallops. So we're looking at a way to detect them. So you can see in the top image there, our scallops are called cryptic over here, unlike the rest of the world. They're very good at throwing sand over themselves and trying to make themselves invisible. So you can, if you're lucky, you can just see the mouth around a scallop. So using high-res cameras in both the RGB and depth values, we've been doing a really good job of identifying them, sizing them and so on, so that what we've got funding for a project now with NIWA is to have a whole array of cameras moving along with some arms with suctions going down and just sucking up the right size scallops and not touching anything else, and leaving all the other lower size scallops there. So yeah, so very cool project. And another one we've been working a long time on is recognizing biofouling on ship hulls, wharf pylons, which divers do every year, and so on. And this ends up being a really large area when you think of all the, a lot of the main wharves around New Zealand and so on. And so, you want to be sure that you're georeferencing this. Ships, I don't know if you'd actually say georeference ships because they move, although we know container ships are so big they need a motorbike to go around them. So are pretty huge areas that we are trying to look at things over. So that's sort of the end of my talk, and thank you very much for listening. And Matt just asked me to put this in here. The next speaker is Philip, CTO for Kia Aerospace. So yeah, really really seriously cool, interesting stuff. I remember judging a competition they ended a couple of years ago, and they're doing some cool stuff. So I'll hand you back to
Thank you, Richard.
yeah. I'll just
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for giving the plug for the next seminar as well.
oh, you're welcome.
Oh, it's one of the weird things about Zoom is you can't hear the applause, but I'm sure there's lots because that was some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
We'd welcome some questions. We've got about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, sorry, I took a bit longer than I should have.
No, not at all. Really great. So what I'll do is invite either people to type in the chat, or you can unmute and just ask Richard a question directly if you have one.
John Mawson here from Plant Food. G'day,
Hi,
Richard.
Yeah, hi, John.
A very interesting talk. Thanks, Richard. Wonder if you've just got some comments about biofouling of your cameras in the underwater and how you deal with that.
No, that's a really good point. So at the moment, of course, they're not staying under the water because we're still in the testing phase. But talking to Cawthron, we've been talking about the concept of, because they've been developing a whole lot of buoy technology with a whole lot of sensor stuff on it, the concept of docking in a buoy and then just pumping the water out. And I know, for example, oysters, where the tide goes out, the sun and the air burns all the biofouling off them. So if you can just expose them so they're on water all the time, the biofouling dies off. So it's a very good point though, and because anything stays underwater, stuff grows on it, which is a real pain. And I know people have got technology like where they've got cameras under the water, they've got sort of wipers on it to try and keep it off. And then there's all this toxic biofouling on ship hulls. But yeah, very good question. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, John. Any other questions? Luke?
Richard, I've got a question.
Yeah.
For your forestry drones, to georeference that data, are they using GPS?
Yep, that's a very good question. So the commercial forests where they want to prune for clearwood are generally planted about 5 meters apart. And when we're pruning them, we're not thinking of full-grown 30-meter trees. They tend to be much younger, and so there's a lot of sky visible.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly
So I thought the same thing. I started to talk to Trimble and everyone else. What do you do when you're under the canopy and you can't get your GPS? And then I realised, oh, wait a minute, we're not pruning then anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That kind of relates to a question I had regarding your methods outside of the pruning season. So how would they cope with monitoring things like crop yield and how grapes are growing? You're going to have obviously lots more leaves and things in the way.
Yep. Oh, that's a good question. I never covered it. Okay. So the reason that I've got an array of cameras is I discovered that I need to have views going up as well as views going down and reasonably wide angles. So when they move along, I can see, behind the leaves that way, behind the leaves that way, and doing that on both sides. And I've found by having enough views like that, a high enough resolution, you can do really good estimates of what's behind the leaves, because they're not dense like a dense camellia bush or hedge. They're sort of relatively sparse from that point of view if you've got enough camera views. And also the other thing we're doing is by doing them every 2 weeks, we already know exactly what the branch structure is underneath. So we've got very good estimates of where they'll be flowering and so on. And yeah. It's a good question though, yeah, because that's always a pain. How do you solve the occlusion problem? And I confess it's really a brute force approach.
What about other types of data? Like I'm curious as to how your system would compare to a LiDAR, more traditional LiDAR, I guess.
So because we want sub-millimeter resolution, you're probably going to have like a $50,000 LiDAR really close, to get, that sort of resolution. And also you don't get color. And we really wanted color as well as a resolution. We're trying to keep the cost down. So although LiDAR is good for navigation and knowing where we are in relation to other objects, in terms of getting that very, very high quality 3D semantic model of every plant, we just couldn't, we didn't give the color and we needed much higher resolution, hence the 12 megapixel global shutter cameras.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether you could use an iPhone 12 or something like that, or an array of
Yeah,
them,
well,
because they have the radar on now.
Yeah, I've seen people do that because the tech on them is so amazing. Yeah, I've seen people actually cobble them in to their computer vision pipeline as, the sensor, because it's doing all this pre-processing on the images, which is awesome. Yeah, I know. Well, I'm so tempted so often to go down that path instead of the expensive machine vision cameras we're using. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure, Dean.
Well, thanks, Richard. Yeah, really, really interesting presentation, and yeah, lots of technology I didn't realise was out there. I just wanted to make a comment, not so much from my research area, but as like I'm an Indigenous forest owner, and I'm just going through the process at the moment of developing a management plan, so I can harvest within the forest. And one of the first things I have to do is collect data, go out there, do plots, and I've got 30 plots in the forest, 120 hectare forest.
Yeah.
And had to measure 450 trees essentially, so that took a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And then I'll go through the process, and it'd be ideal if you could measure every tree in your forest and and know what the species are as well, because like I've red beech and hard beech in the forest, and sometimes up on the ridges it's easy to tell, that's a hard beech, and the red beech tend to be kind of more down in the gullies or the sort of the easier slopes. But where they kind of mingled, and the leaves on the ground and mingling, it's actually really difficult to see which species you're recording. And I just tended to record them as I kind of saw fit in terms of, that kind of looks like a red beech, it looks like about right. But if you looked on the ground, there'd be a mixture of leaves, and I wasn't able to climb the trees or anything. So that, collecting all that data would be way easier for a start, although I did enjoy spending 2 or 3 weeks in the bush. But the other thing is that at the end of the day, I'll get a permit, I'll get a plan approved, I'll get a yield that the ministry allows me to harvest, but that ends up being like 70% of your so-called sustained yield. And then after 10 years, you come back and you can measure it again, and then they'll allow you to harvest up to 80% of your sustained yield. But this sort of technology could kind of bypass or enhance a lot of that, so that I wouldn't actually have to go out in 10 years and do that. And also I could actually say to the ministry, this is a way more accurate way of doing it, because the reason they say, oh, you've got to go back and measure it, there's all these sort of errors in your sampling. So yeah, I just wanted to say, kind of from the perspective of a potential user out there, it's really awesome technology.
Oh, thanks, Dean. Just so you know, we've just broken 3 CAA regulations by having multiple drones per person, having them fly autonomously, and having them fly beyond line of sight, which is what we need to do for this. But they have said to me, because I said, look, here's the money. Here's where the money is in the future. You've got to think of where you're going with your regulations. And they said, well, look, if there's a sufficiently, good, rigorous health and safety plan, that your drone is, most unlikely to pole drive into a hunter's face, who shouldn't even be in your forest, then they're okay with that. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Sounds like another development that can happen. Any other questions? All right, so with 5-2, give you another 10 seconds.
Oh yeah, hi Richard, it's Daniel Bintul here from Plant and Food Research. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could give a little more detail on how you go from like a segmented point cloud to the branching structure of the tree.
Right, so that's essentially doing a skeletonization. So we've got our point cloud, it's really nice and clean, really high res, very high quality depth values. So from there, starting from the ground up essentially, because we understand natural branching, branches get smaller and so on. We are sort of doing a combination of fitting cylinders and balls within those, doing a best fit, and then aligning them along the branch direction. So yeah, and it's basically a sort of a new deep learning approach we're taking there to enable that. So that's Oliver Batchelor and Harry Dobbs. Oliver Batchelor is a postdoc and Harry Dobbs is a PhD student. They're making some really good progress on that, because a lot of people have done skeletonization on 2D, but very few on voxels they have, but very few on like 3D point clouds, which is slightly messier than what people are usually working with. Yes, it's a good question. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, I think we're just about there. Thanks everyone for coming along, and in particular, thank you, Richard, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Please join us again in a few weeks' time. Richard, you got that slide? It was Philip from Kia Aerospace. We'll be talking about there on the 26th of November, I believe. But don't worry if you don't have it.
Right, I can do that. Here it is.
There it is. So Philip Schlutrop, from the CTO from Kia Aerospace, will be here on the 26th of November. And he'll be talking about, actually, this is a really awesome platform, which is kind of fitting in the gap between airborne remote sensing, or is high altitude airborne remote sensing, and satellite remote sensing. So come along and hear about all of that then. Otherwise, let me thank you all for coming, and Richard, thank you once again for presenting. Really excellent work. I'm looking forward to catching up with you, talking about some more developments we can do. So yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks everyone.